Benvenuti, buonasera, grazie a tutti. Facciamo questo in inglese. Covering the tough topics is the panel today, and we've got an array of people from different backgrounds, from different ends of the news business, I think, with different perspectives on what's tough. Just go from one end to the other. Over here we have Raju Narzetti from News Corp, and I think when everybody starts talking, we'll get a better idea of what it actually means, the titles, the work behind the titles. And this is Alexander Gerlach from the European, where he's the founder and owner. And this is Lucy Marcus.
You've known me 20 years.
Full disclosure, we grew up in the same neighborhood and went to high school together.
But he still doesn't know my name.
And she is a columnist and board director, and I think one of the interesting questions here would be, which comes first, and how do you cover your own tough topics when you're an insider? And Ed Fraser from Channel 4 News, managing editor. And why don't we work our way back this way? And I'll just say, when I think about the tough topics, I think there's sort of a layer of some of the obvious issues. Does a news organization or a freelancer have the financial resources? That can make a topic very difficult to cover. There's physical danger. These are the sort of things that come up most. These are the big things. There are also some gray areas. We know everybody wants to be safe in the field and have their journalism completely and fabulously funded so they can do everything they want. But when do these things come into conflict? If you resolve one or resolve the other. On the next layer down, are there issues in conflicts of interest? Are there issues in ownership and conflicts of interest? Are there political pressures that journalists face? And really one that I think doesn't get a lot of attention a lot of time are the legal issues, legal constraints, are the various legal systems. We're working in a global journalism marketplace. How do we keep track of all of the legal pressures that we face? I work for Bloomberg News. I'm based in Rome. My name is Vernon Silver, and I'm on a global projects and investigations team. So from where I sit, I'm looking at everything from the US to Africa to the Middle East, Europe, Asia. So a broad area of having to figure out how to best use our resources, and time is another one to mention. There's a limited amount of that also, in doing what we can do. So let's start over here with Ed.
Okay. Tough topics. I thought tough topics and inaccessible places are inextricably linked, really. For me, you've got to invest in your journalism. You've got to invest in... Hi, can you hear me now? Okay, we're on. So for me, you've got to invest in journalism. You've got to invest in your journalists. And Channel 4 News have some of the best journalists in the world. I think of Alex Thompson and Matt Fry, Lindsay Hilsum. I could go on. And what we want to do at Channel 4 News is tell the real story, the story that people don't want you to hear, to get to the real truth, the unvarnished truth, and hold authority to account, find the people in power, and cause trouble for them. So we are the agents provocateurs of journalism, if you like. I was thinking about inaccessible places because, where are the most inaccessible places we've been to? And the obvious one that sprung to mind was Central African Republic, where we flew a team in and they arrived in the capital, Bangui. We're one of the first Western journalist teams in the country. And we filmed bodies lying at the gates of Parliament that hadn't been picked up for days. We found families, tens of thousands of families, sleeping under tarpaulins at the airport in appalling conditions. We witnessed murder taking place on the streets. In the north of the country, we filmed with a family, and the only thing holding back the marauding hordes of Seleka militants with machetes, tens of thousands of them just 10 miles away, were a couple of guys with guns and a couple of Save the Children aid workers. So these are kind of inaccessible places where we've managed to get access and tell a story to the world that wasn't being covered before it started to become mainstream. But I was thinking, what is the most inaccessible place we've been to? And I suspect that it was probably Somalia. We have an Africa reporter called Jamal Osman, who is from Somalia himself, and he managed to gain the trust of Al-Shabaab, and they took him on this journey, secret journey. He didn't know where he was going to end up, and he ended up at an Al-Shabaab training camp and was able to film in this camp with foreign fighters being trained, was able to film with them as they met with the local community where they'd imposed Sharia law. But he was able to hold to account the Al-Shabaab leader and sat down and interviewed him and asked him about the Westgate Mall shopping massacre. So this is kind of the raison d'etre of Channel 4 News, is kind of holding to account, holding authority to account, and getting to inaccessible places. My job's to give the reporters the tools to do the job, to be able to push boundaries, to be able to push to the nth degree on risk, take as much risk as possible, but within a controlled environment, and not step over the line, because that's important. But when you talk about inaccessible places, obviously safety is paramount. I mean, I know better than most in terms of safety. I was in Iraq in 2003 and got injured by a mortar on the outskirts of Basra when the Iraqi Fedayeen launched a mortar attack on our position. My cameraman was able to get me out and get me to a British military hospital for emergency surgery. The team that you put in place in the field is paramount. If you're going to put people into hostile environments, they have to be trained, they have to know what they're doing, they have to have experience. So we have that as a kind of key priority, a cornerstone of Channel 4 News, that we don't go to inaccessible places and take unnecessary risks unless we've done the math and done the homework. We concentrate on 1 hour of journalism a day. So we are digital, we put our material up online, we put stuff up before the programme, but this 1 hour gives us a real focus for our journalism, our investigative journalism, something that we can really sort of hone in our stories on. And it's all about storytelling, and it's all about impact. And for me, impact is one of the defining things. Impact is how you change things, it's how you influence, it's your reports that lead to an investigation, lead to an inquiry, lead to a resignation. And I thought of the real world impact that Alex Thompson had when he flew to the Philippines, and he was on the ground covering the cyclone, and somebody tweeted him and said, "Can you try and find my family? They haven't been in touch for days." So he followed this journey then and got on a boat and went for miles in the darkness and arrived on this island, and eventually started wandering up a dirt track where he found the family still alive, and we were able to reunite them. So the power of social media, he used his satellite phone, power of telecommunication and television. We filmed both ends in London and over in the Philippines, and it's a real kind of 360-degree story. So while we're in the hour-long news business, I think all journalists, we're all now in the 24-hour news business. Social media has changed everything. All journalists now have to be experts in social media. It's about journalism plus. We sent Matt Fry to the Ukraine. Incidentally, if you haven't seen the film that he put out the day of the shootings in Kiev in the square, the day of the uprising, it's one of the finest pieces of television journalism you'll ever see. Visceral storytelling, really, really powerful. But he was on the ground. He, as well as doing his mainstream job of reporting for television, he was tweeting pictures, he was tweeting eyewitness accounts, and he was blogging for us on the website. And then we got him to anchor the show. We decided, this is the most important story in the world right now. We're going to anchor the show from there. And so he was able to sub-anchor to Lindsay Hilsum in Crimea and really put, bang for our buck on the story. A very small team, instead of sending in multiple teams to really sort of cover the story, it was like a very small team dedicated to really kind of telling that story in a profound way. Alex Thompson was recently in Afghanistan for the elections, and there was a house which was shot up, a lot of people killed, and he went in with his iPhone and reported as live, this bullet-riddled walls, blood everywhere, and this sort of 5-minute video, more powerful than the piece he even put on television that night, went straight to social media so people could really get inside that story and understand what was really going on the ground. So for me, it's about the power of storytelling. It's about 360 degrees storytelling. It's the complete package. It's the complete picture, and your journalists have to provide that in this day and age.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, what do you think makes the difference? Why are you able to do that and get that kind of access when others can't? What's the key bit?
I think we invest in our journalists. We have brilliant journalists, and it's very hard to get a job at Channel 4 News, but when you do, you know you're at the top of your game, and the people we have are some of the finest journalists. The producers behind them are some of the finest journalists. So, we gain the trust of people. They trust the program. They know that we'll tell the story in long form. It won't be a short form, 1.5 minute. Because we've got an hour, we've got the luxury of being able to say, right, we're going to go big on this, and we're going to really do something that has an impact. And so that's what we do. And
you think it's more of that virtuous cycle of the journalists know that they're going to have this opportunity, therefore it attracts them, and it goes more so than paying good money or
no, I think it's about investing in the story as much as the money. It's about investing the time, the resource, and the people in the story. It's about saying, if a journalist comes to me and says, I've got a great story, I want to investigate it, but I don't know how long it's going to take, then if we buy into that, then they can have as much time as they want within boundaries, but we'll put a team on it, we'll build people around that story, and we'll get it to air. And often stories that look impossible will get to air.
Great.
Do you know who I am?
I think I remember.
Do you remember me? Maybe if I were a little thinner and a little younger. Exactly. Check your yearbook. You'll find me there. Good afternoon. I'm Lucy Marcus, and I'm delighted to be here. This is a topic that's actually close to my heart because I cover an area that is also truly a black box. My day job is a board director. I sit on the board of an Italian company, Atlantia, and I sit on a board of a number of other companies. And so one of the several things I teach and I write and do other things, but I'm a board director. But my job as a journalist, and I'm not sure I actually consider myself as a journalist, is I'm a columnist for Reuters, and I also host a TV show for Reuters. And the TV show is In the Boardroom with Lucy Marcus, and I cover the boardroom. If you talk about some of the most inaccessible places and some of the most dangerous places, I think of the boardroom. Because if you think about the last 5 to 10 years, before that actually, many people didn't even know what a boardroom was or who sat in it or what happened. There was a mysterious room. If you think about your vision of the boardroom, I once tried to explain to my then 5-year-old what it was, and he's a little British boy, and so I said to him it was a little like if you think about King Arthur and the Round Table, and they walk in this oak-covered room, and the door closes with a whoosh, and then several people, men usually, sit around the table, and there's King Arthur sort of at the proverbial head of the table, and the doors are closed, and it's sort of a hush falls over, and there's a discussion about big and important things, and these wise men hold this discussion, and then they leave the room and do wise and good things for the betterment of society and the company. And I think a lot of people think that in some ways that's what happens in a boardroom, and that they're particularly intelligent and caring and concerned and wise people, and we speak a special sort of thee and thou language. And actually, that's not completely what happens. The door does close and everything is kept outside, and we are in a very closed room, and we do speak a special sort of thee and thou language. Everyone's terribly polite and so on in the boardroom. But it's debatable whether we are having very intelligent conversations or very in-depth conversations, and whether we're asking the hard questions that we need to, and whether we're as wise as we need to be. But I believe very strongly that actually that metaphor works well, and that we should be striving for that actually that ideal is what we should be doing in the boardroom. When I started writing about the boardroom, there was pretty much no one who was a sitting board director writing about the boardroom. There were lawyers and accountants and journalists who covered it, but nobody who actually sat around that table and had that sort of insight. And to me, it seemed as if it was very important to challenge what happens in the boardroom and what we as board directors do, But the tough part of it is sitting in the boardroom and covering the boardroom, and this question of, is there a conflict about doing that? And I find over time that the more boards that I sit on and the more I get to know the boardroom, the harder it is to cover it as transparently as I would like to. And yet I hold myself to account to do that, because I think it's very important that people understand what happens in that room, that we make that room more accessible, and that you know who is in that boardroom, because the decisions that we make as board directors impact all of you every day. The chairs you sit on are made by a company, and if a company decides that it doesn't have the money to spend on reliable materials, then as you're sitting here, you'll all fall on the floor. And a lot of those decisions in macro or even micro ways come from the top of an organization. And that becomes more and more important as you think of public utilities or the books that your children have in school. The publishing company is run by a board and a chief executive, and the decisions that they take about where they spend money and whether or not they should learn this kind of history or that kind of history impact the kind of things that your children are learning in school. So it's very important to empower people to understand who's in the boardroom. And only in the last 5 years, if you look at news stories, that there has always been a sort of cult of the chief executive, but nobody has really had transparency into the boardroom. And since the time of writing about it, and then we see things like the Occupy movement and having discussions in mainstream media and Channel 4 and so on about who's the board director, or who was on the board of Lehman Brothers, and are those people still board directors in other companies? Yeah, some of them are. And following that trail of power and money, it's very important to know these things, but it's very hard to find out that information. And so we've seen a transition over time of more transparency into that, and I hold myself to account and take a great deal of responsibility in making sure that I'm reporting as honestly as I can what happens in the boardroom, and understanding what happens in the boardroom, making it more accessible. The TV show that I host, I sit down with other board directors and we have a conversation, and we strive to make it as much a conversation between two peers, and it's as if we're having a cup of tea and you're there with us, and we're having a frank conversation about what's easy, what's hard, where the boardroom is going. And it's the first time really that instead of having somebody grill a board member but not be able to say, actually, I have to call time on what you're saying because I have sat in the boardroom and it's sometimes with you, and I know that's not the truth. So it comes with a sense of authority to be able to say, actually, I'm a director, you're a director, let's just have a frank chat about what's going on. And that, I think, has changed a lot the tenor and made more transparency. You mentioned social media. I use Twitter an enormous amount. I use it for a couple of reasons, in a couple of ways. I'm on both send and receive, and I use it as a means of also making the boardroom more accessible, the topics about activism in the boardroom and the role of board directors and all of us as people holding board directors to account, all of you holding me to account, and sharing information. I think it's made a huge impact into how people perceive things that used to be black boxes, be it countries or boardrooms. And to me, that's very important. But I will be frank with you, because it's just us chickens. I sometimes find that it's a challenge to write as honestly as I think should be done, because I sometimes feel like, is it a conflict between my two roles? A lot of what I write a couple of different kinds of things. I write what I kindly call clip and send pieces, where I write something about how you should behave as a director, and I get a lot of emails back from people saying, thank you so much for writing it. I clipped it and I sent it to my board, because there are several people on the board who I think should read it, and they clip on a regular basis and send it so that actually the one that they really want them to read, they get that one as well without being rude and saying, yeah, you are a Deadwood director, you should resign. So it's an easy way of sending the tough message. The other kind of piece that I write is news-driven. So if something happens on the Barclays board or something, then I will write about that and talk about a good way of analyzing and understanding what happens, be it executive compensation, remuneration issues, or risk issues, or Deadwood directors. That's board members who have been on boards for, if you can believe it, 30, sometimes 40 years. You know, they're like popes used to be. You could only carry them out feet first, you know. And things like that, that to us, when we think about them, don't sound like, it just is a no-brainer that wouldn't make sense, but actually within this sort of black box of the boardroom sometimes makes sense. So I'll leave it there, but I think the definition of tough topics, it can be being under a hail of bullets literally, or being under a hail of bullets figuratively. And my goal is, you know, I spend time talking to journalists as well about how they can bring transparency to the boardroom and how they can ask the tough questions and hold board members to account in a world where they were used to not even bothering to ask the question because board members would say, I can't answer that, I'm under confidentiality. And now it's more and more we're being held to account personally. So.
From the journalistic perspective of what you do you think that there's a way to extrapolate the model of insider as journalist to other things? I mean, would you be comfortable advising that you know, soccer players cover soccer from their point of view while they're still playing, that soldiers should, you know, beyond just blogging or tweeting, become journalists from the field in a more regular way that matches what you do? I mean, sort of take it all over the place. Should bankers be covering banking? Would that work, or are you at the very top of the corporate chain in a sort of unique place that doesn't work?
That's a great. I've never thought about that. That's a great question. Well done. I feel a certain pride. It's a great question because I have to tell you, it takes an enormous amount of discipline to write about it as objectively as possible. And I have made for myself a couple of rules. I impose them very hard on myself. I never write about the boards I sit on. You will never see me writing anything about Atlantia or the other boards that I sit on. I sit on a biotech incubator board and a biotech fund board. I'll never write about those boards. And I never tweet stories or press stories written about the companies whose boards I sit on, because I'm very careful about making sure that I'm not endorsing something or in some way sending a message, because I know that the role of corporate director, people look at you and look for signals or messages. So that to me is paramount. On the other hand, I think that it's possible to write about issues-based things or other boards carefully, and be able to say something. So if you're a football player, a soccer player, and you want to write about racism in the game, I would endorse it. I think that's really powerful. And to be able to talk about it from a first-person perspective versus a third-person perspective and not an academic perspective, I think that would be great. If you're a banker, you know, the problem is that when you're inside a large institution, as a board director, I'm involved in organizations, but I'm fairly independent. So no one can tell me, you can't write about Yahoo, or you can't write about this because it's our company. I have no PR department or communications department telling me I can't do that. I think it's difficult if you're within an organization and they would worry that you would bring ill repute to that organization. And also because I've written so long that the boards I join now know that I write, and they know my ethical center of how I write, so they know that I'm always careful. It's easier. I think it would be difficult in some organizations if you were writing critically about the banking industry and you're in the bank to do it in a non-self-promotional way or a bank conflict way or something. But I do think that it's possible to write about issues and talk about a dismay in the ethics of how banking is conducted or something else. And I think that is actually a useful thing. So thinking about it, I think the more people, you know, it also goes to, and I bet Raji will talk about this a little bit, but user-generated content sort of things, that when we tweet, and I use Twitter, I use Instagram, when I'm I never tweet from a board meeting, but from Atlantia AGM, so we had an EGM in August, and I tweeted from that. It was public, but not everybody could get into it, and so I was sharing information from that. And that's okay to me, and it gives an insider view, because to me it's important that I take you with me in the place. Just one other thought, which is, you were talking about shooting with a mobile phone, and I talked about this on our panel a little bit yesterday. One of the things I do like to do, I went to the Ambrosetti Forum in September, not as a media person, so I wasn't pushed aside and kept us outside. I was in there also as a participant, and I was armed with just my phone and a microphone, and I did several videos that then my producer brilliantly stitched together into something cogent, and that was an insider view of what was happening there with access to all the participants and 30-second snippets of their view on certain things, and that came out as, I think, a very powerful video, which from a user-generated, knowledgeable perspective really gave that insider view. So.
Is that, yeah, wow, I'm deeply impressed because, I'm moved by the stories you were telling.
I wish you went to our high school.
I'm still thinking about how I present this now, because I was not prepared now to amaze you with the gorgeousness of my magazine, but the European is in fact at least as gorgeous as Channel 4 and that what Lucy is doing. I want to come straight to the topic of this panel. The European, that's the only sentence you hear from me, is a debate magazine. So the places where we have to go is the inside of a person, the brain, so to speak, the core of the personality. Why is somebody saying something that he or she is saying? What is the basis of one's argument? We see this today in the Crimea crisis, that we try to figure out what Mr. Putin is thinking, or what Frau Merkel is thinking, or what the American president does think about a certain the issue itself. So that means for journalism that it's not only about being where the people are, but to understand what drives them. And this makes for journalists and journalism in the future the biggest necessity to study a lot, to get to know the people, to get to know why people are, why they behave as they behave. And I'm not of the opinion, as Ed said in the beginning, that journalism is about to be as close as possible to the families you brought about. There's a strong view in journalism to be as much apart from it as not engaging in the story, so not being as a journalist the one who helps then finally find some people. I mean, this is from a humanistic standpoint a very good thing, but from a journalistic point of view, you become a party of the endeavor, and that's in traditional journalism something you should never have been doing. Another thing, what you said, Lucy, is very interesting, because, of course, as a journalist, you always have a stance. You are in favor of this or that party. You have this or that background. You have that religion. You have that town where you grew up and where you have your own personal histories. But it's a very tough topic to then engage and be in a boardroom and then write about the boardroom itself. So this describes what the two of you said is at the very core of the problems that journalism today faces, because we have so many people sending and we receive so much, and we have to know why people send their message out, and this is the big challenge we also face in the debate magazine. So now shoot your questions.
Yeah, is there a special challenge, or is it somewhat easier when you're dealing in opinion? I mean, if it sounds like you're trying to get at some version, not so much of the truth, but of what people's intentions are, and to give a better view just of what's happening in the world through the debate. Is opinion, and again, this is taking the same slant of, do we start learning some lessons about how to tackle traditional journalism? Do you have an advantage in dealing with opinion, or is it also possibly a disadvantage? How do you see it?
When I explain to people once in a while what debate journalism is about, they say, oh, well, that's easy, because you don't have to go somewhere, and you don't have to be in the jungle or in a boardroom, and well, it's not that easy, because you have a journey always within the people's thought and people's idea, and you have to research that carefully. So when it's easy, because in a debate we can of course show a CEO, and the CEO explains his opinion or her opinion by, of course, by the views of the company he or she is working for. But this person worked somewhere before, and then he has worked somewhere, then he studied there, and they know from the neighborhood and this and that, and all to bring all the pieces together, why somebody has this or that opinion, is very difficult. And in this regard, we also need the readers, because we do that very carefully, but we may not know who went to school with whom together. And so the readers tell us, oh, you know that he studied there, and they know each other from this organization. So it's a very research intensive thing. It's not, oh, I throw an opinion and that's it.
Thank you. So I want to take a slightly macro view of this. If we were doing the same panel maybe 5 years ago or 7 years ago, there would have been a lot of debate around the fact that because of what's happening to newspapers and the media industry, there was a lot of concern that investigative journalism covering tough topics, being able to send correspondents to foreign bureaus, to wars, was going to be the first casualty of the underlying problems for our business. Everybody feared that that would be really cut back, and who would really do tough stories because the industry is in such trouble, all the jobs are being cut. In a very strange way, it's never been an easier time to cover tough topics for a variety of reasons. The whole shift of audiences to digital has actually meant that our ability to engage our audiences in tough topics has gotten a lot easier. In the newspaper world, a reporter would spend a lot of time digging through a bunch of documents and kind of really pouring through them and write maybe a long 5,000, 10,000 word story. You may put a picture of the document in the paper. That was the extent of being able to engage our audiences. But in the digital world, what has happened is that we now have the ability to not just tell, but also show. The onset of video has meant that we can take our readers behind the scenes to very tough places, whether it's Somalia or whether it's a war zone, or even when it comes to kind of tracking corruption. We can actually take people to those places now because of video. Because of databases and the spread of interactivity, we can now allow our audiences to actually kind of play with the original documents and the original information that reporters and investigative journalists used to have, that they can actually engage in. You can now put a database and have a reader plug in their PIN code or a zip code to find what's happening in their particular neighborhood with that particular issue. So this has really dramatically improved the access of our readers to tough topics. The other reason why you are seeing significant investigative journalism, especially in the US and all over, is because that is the one thing, if you do, that your competition cannot really catch up. Because what's happening these days, if you break a story, within 5 minutes, or in fact a couple of minutes, there are 10 other people writing about the same thing on Twitter and Facebook and drawing away audiences. But if you have a story that you worked on with a lot of databases and a lot of underlying data, it's not particularly replicable. So it remains a fairly unique, compelling, competitive story for a very long time. There is, most of it's not a tough story, but most of you are familiar with New York Times' Snowfall project. And it came up in a panel yesterday as well. People could write as much as they want to write about snowfall, but they cannot replicate snowfall because it takes 3 months to create something like that. So you had that, and you had the audiences, and you had the engagement for months on end. Similarly, with investigative journalism, if you have the right databases and if you have the right tools and right engaging devices, that story stays with you for a very long time, even if competition is trying to do other things. The other interesting thing was that most newspapers used to do this big, giant investigative projects, tough stories, and you had no idea if anybody ever read them. You thought they did because you put them on your front page, or you did a 4-part series, and you assumed because you did a lot of work, you put in a lot of words, a lot of readers read it. The advantage of digital now is that you can actually measure whether your tough stories, whether your investigative stories are being read. And if they're not being read, the problem is not with the reader. The problem is we are not doing it in a way that is engaging our audiences. I'll give you a simple example from my days at the Washington Post as managing editor. We did this amazing story about post 9/11 contracts and how a bunch of contractors in Alaska were misusing that and taking a lot of money. And the story was, it was a 2-part story. It was beautifully laid out on the page, a lot of photographs. And before the story jumped to an inside page, there was a paragraph that said, this is what the story is about. The story ran, Congress got all upset, they changed the law, the contractor was indicted, And it was the perfect, successful Washington Post investigative story. When I looked at the numbers on mobile, turned out that the story was a complete disaster. Virtually nobody read the story on mobile. And I started thinking there was a disconnect here, and then I discovered, and Washington, D.C. at that time was a big BlackBerry town because most government offices issue BlackBerries. It took 46 screens of a BlackBerry to finish the story. Right? Fair enough. Nobody's going to read such a 6,000-word story on a BlackBerry. But the problem was in laying out the story in print and in making sure that the story says this is a story about X or Y before you jump the story, and in laying it out on the web, we made sure that readers, before they had to click on a page or turn the page, understood what the story was. None of us thought about mobile. So it was the 7th screen of your phone before we even told you what the story was about, because the first 6 screens were this very long, beautiful anecdotal lead from Anchorage, Alaska. It was beautiful in print, but nobody thought about the experience on mobile. So hardly anybody read the story on mobile. And at that time, the Washington Post probably had about 15, 18% of its audience consuming it on mobile. That entire audience never really consumed that story. So we now have the ability in the digital world to be able to kind of tailor our tough stories, tailor our packages in such a way that we can make them that much more compelling because we can see the data. And then there are a lot of, if you attended some of the sessions this week, there were some amazing examples about how technology is allowing journalists around the world who don't have the resources to do tough stories. Paul Radu's group does some amazing work on chasing the money, open source tools that allow you to follow corruption, corrupt governments, and corrupt officials. And he showed some great examples of that. Justin Arnstein talked a little bit about Code for Africa and what he's doing, where simple tools are allowing readers to kind of say, if an oil company was supposed to pay royalties, are they paying, and what's happening to that money? Again, open source tools. Mariana Santos talked about Chicas Pedrosos and what they're doing in Latin America, where they're able to kind of, with digital tools, allow people to track politicians and the nexus between politician and government. So technology has really kind of enabled us to do tough stories in a much easier way, to engage our audiences in a much bigger way. So I think it's a very positive trend. The one slight issue that we've faced, especially in the US, in this transition from traditional print and media to digital business models, is there's been amazing investigative tough stories at the national level. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all of the big papers have actually increased their investigative teams. ProPublica didn't used to exist. It is now, I think, 5 or 6 years old, does some really amazing stories. So the national investigative stories, the national tough stories have only been more. Bloomberg has a big team now. Reuters has a big team now that they didn't have before. The problem is it is at the city and the local government level where the troubles of our industry have meant that the tough stories are not being done. Nobody is really putting enough efforts to find out if the mayor is paying his wife and his cousin and to do projects for the government, or if they're giving themselves 3 times the salary. And that's an area which remains a big concern, especially in the US, that the city and local government level tough stories are not being done. And unfortunately, hyperlocal models have still not succeeded. Patch has been a big failure. Nothing has kind of really come around to fund that kind of journalism. So that remains a real problem that hasn't been resolved yet as our industry has transitioned from traditional print to digital, and remains a bit of an open question. How can we kind of fund that kind of tough stories?
So, I mean, take yourself back again 5 years ago, as per your example. The job that you have now, would that have existed 5 years ago? And I mean, and I'm thinking about the idea of the metrics that are involved, the interplay between the newsroom and the business side. I mean, how does what you do now exist only now and couldn't have existed 5 years ago?
I think in the newspaper world, it is hard to kind of get real-time data. And so you just assume that every story you did, especially if you wrote on the front page, was read by every single reader, and you were very happy about that knowledge without knowing the facts. Now you can kind of at least understand if a newspaper thought this story was important enough to send somebody to Sudan, and then you do a 3-part stories, and hardly anybody is reading it, the obligation is on you to make that much more compelling and engaging. So I think there's a lot more data to it. The other thing that has changed is that while we still do it, In the old days, the investigative team would go off and about 6 months later would come back with a story, and then you would put it together and you would publish it. I think now there's a little bit more pressure to do them a little faster, but also to kind of say, don't hide the tools to yourself to do 2 great stories. Give the tools to your readers so they can read your 2 great stories and actually do a lot more with it themselves. So there's been a transparency in how investigative teams and tough teams actually do their work, and I think that's good for everybody.
And what is it going to take for the local level to catch up or to find a model?
That's a tough one because it is possible that there would be some benevolent funding. Somebody says, I care about the city of Chicago and I'm going to fund a local enterprise to cover Chicago. There may be enlightened city governments that say we're going to set aside 2% of our budget to cover city issues, though that comes with some strings, I suppose. But that's a space where pure for-profit models have still struggled to figure out how to do it, because when you do tough stories, a lot of your normal advertisers and all actually don't want to be associated with it, even though they may not have a problem with it. So single issue sites, for example, Deeply Syria, is doing some of the toughest stories about a country and about a region that not many of us care because it's been going on so long. It's very hard for Deeply Syria to get like a Boeing or a Procter & Gamble or a Coke to advertise in it, because the stories are all about death and destruction and sorrow. So there's a genuine problem in how to fund that. So it has to be funded by either a Ford Foundation or a Knight Foundation or some individual willing to do that. So that remains a bit of a struggle.
I mean, one area that didn't quite come up was the interplay between the money part of getting access and the danger part of getting access to the stories. And I think we've seen in many instances that certainly if you go in with no money and no resources into the dangerous place, you're at much greater risk than if you go in with a big team who've all been to training and they've had their hostile environment preparations and they've got the equipment and they have a backup plan and maybe a private jet waiting somewhere to whisk them off. What direction, and anyone feel free to pick this one, what direction are we going now in terms of those 2 main obstacles to access interplaying in a deadly way?
The first thing I would say is that you can't take risks with people's lives. That's paramount, that's sacrosanct. I mean, Syria is a case in point. It's incredibly difficult to cover that story. One of the only ways you can cover it, there are really 3 ways you can cover it. You can either go in with the government forces in Damascus, which we have done, but you can tell one side of the story, you can't tell the other side of the story. It's safer. Going into the north of the country is very, very dangerous. We know how many journalists have been kidnapped, killed. It's incredibly dangerous. So really the only way now for Western journalists to cover that story is to use local people on the ground whose lives potentially are at risk, but they've taken a decision to be there. Ethically, is that the right thing to do? It's a question for everybody, really. Or there's a third way, which is through social media. Raju, Storyful will unearth video. We use Storyful. If you haven't got it, if you're in a newsroom and you haven't got Storyful, you should get it. It's great. We'll always put an extra layer of verification, our own verification, on any video that we get into the building, because your brand and your name goes with anything that goes on air for you. And it's vital that we kind of keep on top of the video that's coming out. We have a guy who lives inside these Facebook groups in Syria. He's in the newsroom, but his mind and his eyes are inside Syria all the time, which brings, we've all got to keep an eye on him. We've got to keep aware of him all the time because, he's just sitting at a desk like everybody else, but he's undergoing this kind of trauma, psychological trauma all the time. And he will give us a heads up on video. I mean, I've seen him unearth video an hour after a huge bomb has gone off, and it's HD quality video. It doesn't necessarily tell you a wider story about what's going on in Syria, but it's a microcosm story, and some of those are important to tell. But how we tell and how we define that story in Syria is a test for us all as journalists now.
If I may say something, I guess it's very disappointing to a certain degree in the internet age that, as you pointed out, that we know that big stories we can consider big important stories, are not really estimated by the readers because they simply don't care. That this is not only in regard to the war scenes you described in Syria or Afghanistan. On the other hand, it's every country, the population of a country has a certain perception of the conflicts before we start reporting about them. So let's say in Germany there is a long history how we perceive Russia and how we perceive the United States, and in the actual conflict you have two poles where people would oppose each other, and these ideas about how to perceive Russia or not to perceive Russia are older than the conflict itself. So the media is on one part on the side of the United States, and on the other side on the side of Russia. They are not doing so actively. It's just something that is rooted within you by German history, for instance. So one of the figures in Crimea is Mr. Klitschko, and Germans liked him simply, so, or still like him. So a part of reporting about the conflict in Ukraine is related to that person, and of course to the positive impacts or the positive views on this person. But most of the journalists have never been to that country, and they do not speak the language, and they do not have any idea on the very nature of that conflict. So in the ongoing course of that conflict, and I make this short, then they figured out, oh, there has been an agreement from the European Union with Ukraine, and there was something in it about military and working together on a military base. And wait, this may be the reason why Russia is not so fond of it. Oh, guess, yeah, it is. And we don't need teams on the ground and people rushing in and a plane to fly them out. It's just a bloody document that everybody could read in the last years. So sometimes we really have to know what we talk about, and about information that is already there, and we just need somebody who is really picking that up and reads it.
I just want to be careful we don't blame the internet for everything, because readers probably didn't care about the tough story even pre-internet. It's just that in the internet era we find out that they really don't care. Right? We just assumed in print that everything we write was read. Social media is actually making it both safer and making it more dangerous at the same time. It's making it safer in the sense that, for example, yesterday I was looking at Twitter and somebody said, don't come to this region because anybody who's coming there is getting arrested by the militia, pro-Russian militia or whatever they were saying. So it prevented a bunch of people from driving in there and getting kind of caught as well. But at the same time, because anybody with a phone can now create content, there's also a rush to actually kind of, instead of running from something, people are running to something to tape it and film it. I mean, Claire, in an earlier session, asked a good question about, what are the ethics around that? Because the more newsrooms and media organizations use these, the more you're encouraging people to take risks to go out and do stupid things. So it is becoming kind of both safer as well as both dangerous because of the ease with which you can kind of film things and kind of record things.
I mean, that's a great point in that 5-10 years ago, I think there was a debate over whether contest citations, you looked at, someone has won the Pulitzer for X, Y, and Z and at great personal risk, and there's very often in the contest citations something that to a young journalist would seem as an invitation to go take risks because it'll improve their chances not only of getting the great story but winning an award for it. I think there have probably been some rumblings of let's not always praise that either in the newsroom or in the contest world. Is there talk now where you're accepting reader footage to say, you know what, we just can't take, this is great footage, but if we do this, there are going to be copycats?
Not yet. It's starting to kind of emerge as a theoretical conversation about it because the cause and effect is a little hard to prove. And most newsrooms haven't embraced it to the point where it's a problem. It'll be a happy problem to have, actually, if we do some of that. On the prizes, look, I mean, I was on the Pulitzer Prize jury this year. We had the most entries ever in the history of Pulitzer Prizes this year, which shows that despite all of the concerns we have about our industry, some really amazing work is still being done. So I think prizes do provide an incentive to do really great journalism, do tough stories that you wouldn't have otherwise done. So the occasional somebody is saying that I will go risk my life because the last person who risked it got a prize is probably worth paying the price.
I just wanted to pick up on one point that was made earlier about tough stories and making them accessible, because I think it is incumbent upon us to make sure that people understand what we're talking about and that they do care. And I mean, if I were to describe what I do as, you know, I write about corporate governance, I think we'd all go, oh, that's very, you know, I mean, you know, that's fun at a party. And the first thing that people think about when they think about corporate governance is sort of the legal tick-boxy stuff, and then that's for lawyers and accountants, and it's really dull. But actually, the boardroom is a microcosm of society. It's like a soap opera in a box. And, you know, anything you could possibly imagine, you know, love, hate, tears, laughter, I mean, it all happens in there. And that's not the way people picture it, but actually, it's an extraordinarily exciting place to be, especially if you're a boardroom geek like me. And my job, I think part of it is to make that accessible and to make people realize that I did a piece, a video a while ago that actually was one of the most viewed pieces that I did, and it was called Everybody's a Board Member or something like that. And what I was trying to say was, there is no person in this room that hasn't in some shape or form sat on a board. You're on your co-op board, you're on your kids' parent-teacher board, you're on your community board, you in college were on some sort of committee. We've all been in boards, and what's fascinating about the boardroom is we have the same cast of characters in every boardroom, be it a nonprofit or for-profit or large or small entrepreneurial venture. The principles behind it are the same. You have the chatty guy, you have the one that falls asleep, you have you have all this stuff. I mean, what goes on, the discussions we have are important, and the relationships, and also it's an incredibly hierarchical room. The person who is the chair sets the tone, and so you can have the same group of people having a completely different discussion depending on who's running the room. It is a really exciting place, and part of what I feel is my responsibility is to bring that room to you. And if you want to consume it by in a 400-word piece, and I've got to find a way to do that. And if you can consume it by a piece that I wrote recently that will be coming out shortly about, I did political philosophy at university, and I wrote about the veil of ignorance, Rawls' veil of ignorance, and how it should be a guiding principle for board members. That does not lend itself to a 200-word clicky page. It's not a listicle for BuzzFeed, but it is actually important, and some people will read that and find it interesting and important. I think this question of clicks, though, is not just how many clicks you get, but who reads it. So if I write something and it reaches the audience that's important to me for that story, and that's 10 people, I've done my job. And if I'm writing Everybody's in a Boardroom and I'm trying to engage all of you to understand why the boardroom is sexy and why we need more people in it and how to get in it, then I write that story in a different way so that actually it's more popular. And to me, it's incumbent upon me, and I'm constantly talking to just about how am I going to get people to read this, these people to read this, is I want to make sure that I'm reaching the audience that I think will find it useful. And the broader audience I have, the better it is for some pieces. And for other pieces, I don't think that everyone's going to find the theoretical analysis of Rawls' veil of ignorance as interesting, though, by the way, it is fascinating. But not everybody's going to think it's interesting. So I think it's incumbent upon us to actually make it accessible both in the way we present it, in the medium we use to present it, and all of that stuff, so that we're getting it across. But that's also from my perspective as somebody who writes opinion and wants my words to be read.
I mean, my last question before turning it over to questions from the audience is about the legal patchwork around the world that, depending on where you are and what you're doing journalism about, may criminalize what you do as a journalist. And I think locally here in Italy, it's an issue. I don't know if a foreign correspondent comes in, realizes that there's criminal defamation in Italy. This is an issue that faces Italian journalists or anybody who comes here to do journalism. So just locally here, you can go to jail for the journalism you commit. Farther away in Washington, there are journalists who are fighting to not have to reveal their sources and are going to jail. And of course, the whole idea that the leaks about the NSA could lead to who knows what kind of charges. So my question is about, there's physical, there's money, there are all these other issues, but have they made journalism a crime, and is this something you face?
Not sure things have changed that much over the years in terms of libel laws or defamation laws or criminal laws. What has changed, though, is that your ability to kind of spread a lot more attention to something that a country, because of its laws, is trying to suppress because of social media and others. People are willing to talk about it. There's a lot more pressure on governments to kind of change, just as there's a lot of pressure on the UK government because of the Snowden stuff. So I think beyond that, I'm not particularly seeing easy way to deal with sovereign laws. I mean, that's an issue that's always going to come in the way of doing the kind of journalism that a specific country's journalists need to do.
And have we seen that the web has made it easier to get around those laws? You can still make a story global no matter where.
Right, it's hard to kind of go after somebody who's tweeting a link in a third country that to a content that's kind of banned in, let's say, a second country. So I think there's a little bit more spread of it. But more importantly, I think being able to point out to unjust laws or journalists being imprisoned, I think that's gotten a lot easier. The ability to focus attention on a country in Africa that might decide to put a bunch of people in jail, I think that's become a little easier.
And, we have also learned through the web or the digital change that our profession as a journalist is something that is like a craftswork or like cooking. You can learn it. So to apply the measures of a journalist, you can do that even if you are a nobody, so to speak, in Syria. And we have seen in, let's say, in the Syria conflict for days, at least in the German broadcasting television, that without the camera work, the filming of strangers, of people on the streets, we would not have had any footage. So what we did, what German television did, they just said, "Oh, that's an unclear source of YouTube," but they just have shown it. So that is also part of the reality that there are so many other journalists or tiny journalists or small journalists or journalistic-wise working people on the ground that also makes us humble as journalists, that we have to understand that what we are doing is not rocket science.
I would say we do live in a tough, litigious world. I mean, I do a lot of investigative stuff. I oversee all our investigations, light touch. I don't, but I have to be heavily involved on the legal side, where we will get countless legal letters on certain stories, and when you get the first legal letter in that runs to 15 pages that they don't have a leg to stand on. You just go straight to the back and look at the last paragraph and you kind of count it out. But they will go on and they will employ very heavy-hitting legal firms who can bring down a lot of resource on you. I spent 2 days in the High Court of London fighting a libel action against a group of police officers who accused us of libeling them. They were backed up by the Police Federation, so very powerfully funded. And it all turned on a dime. The story was we had run a report about, which included video of the police officers smashing up this guy's car with baseball bats because they went in hard because they knew he was violent. And our report said they didn't have the intelligence that he was violent, they just went in. 2 days going through minute detail of what we'd said, what they said, and at the end of it, we won. But we could have been hundreds of thousands of pounds out of pocket, and those are really high-stakes gambles and risks that you take. And we do a lot of investigative stuff. We worked last year with the Guardian on one of the Snowden stories and the mobile intercepts, where people would land in a country in Europe and their mobile data would be intercepted by GCHQ and downloaded. And I remember prompting the question, what does this mean, a breach of EU data protection law? on which person with no name gave no answer. So, we are in a kind of a different world now.
I guess for me, the boardroom is, my Italian is not very good, but there are certain words that I know, and a lot of them are legal. I think I'm very aware of things like insider trading laws and conflict of interest and being very careful about what I write. And I draw a very clear line for myself. In my head, I have a picture of where I can go and where I can't go. Where I can go is a lot of places. How I go there, I have to go carefully. And that's why I made a strict rule about I don't write about or talk about the boards I sit on. And I'm very careful about that stuff. And I have to be very careful about the things that people tell me, because I'll hear, as a director, I'll sit with other directors and we'll have conversations, and I divide in my head what is off the record, social conversation, or closed door conversations, and what can I talk about. So I can take notes of things that I think will make interesting stories later on about issues, but I will never write directly or refer directly to those companies or those people, and I'll never even tell a story unless I go back and talk to that person and say, if I abstract this, is that okay with you? Because, of course, that's part of this tough topics question, is that conflict, that constant conflict. But I also think that tension is what makes it interesting for me as well, because I want to tell that story, and so I need to always be careful. And I think that's also goes back to your question before about can anyone do this? I think you have to be able to have very clear sense of black, white, and gray in order to do this. And I think it helps in a way that also I have a global sense of things. I'm British and American. I live in England. I grew up in New York with you. I sit on an Italian board. I consult to boards around the world. And so I bring a universality to it and an international sense to it. But Alex is right as well, that I have my own baggage when I come to it. But I'm very clear. I write opinion, and I always bring my baggage with me and my knowledge with me, which I think informs my writing, but I never say that I write factually, but I never say that it's the only opinion or it is the way it is. It's just my truth, and hopefully people believe my truth and trust my truth. But that's a relationship that I build up with readers over time as well, that they discover whether they think I'm telling a good truth, or whether they think I'm full of, whatever good word you can use there.
Great. Let's go to questions. Domande?
Do we have a mic?
Ed, you touched upon. You touched upon the idea of the ethical issues around using local reporters in Syria, and of course, it's a vital story for us to continue to cover, despite the seemingly falling interest in the story. And it's also the most dangerous place in the world for a journalist to report from. Alex Thompson's taken some great risks and done some great reporting, but it seems like there is a shift, and it's something I've been banging on about. There's a shift towards the outsourcing of this story, the outsourcing towards local reporters, towards freelance reporters who don't have the protection of the big media organizations. They don't have the danger money, they don't have the insurance, the hostile environment training. And at some point, it becomes exploitation, doesn't it? With the situation with Molhan Barakat, the photographer who was stringing for Reuters in Aleppo, who was killed. It was discovered that he was aged 17. So what is the answer? Where do we draw the line, and how do we prevent the use of freelancers in dangerous places becoming exploitation?
Well, as I said earlier, you don't take risks with people's lives. If they're not staff members, it doesn't matter. You don't take risks with people's lives. Alex Thompson is not allowed to go to Damascus anymore. He's not allowed into the country for whatever reason. Lindsay Hilsum is allowed into the country and can get in. We're not using local reporters in the north of Syria, which means the problem is the story remains being untold. So that's very difficult for me as a journalist. It's unpalatable for all of us. But the story is not being told by anyone really, other than through social media video. And social media video, let's face it here, we're not talking about you or I popping out and doing a video and putting it on YouTube. Some of these guys are partisan, and part of the verification that you have to do is, one, identifying where exactly that video has come from. Is it authentic? How do you prove it is what it says it is, what it purports to be? But then there's an additional level, which is what is it telling us, and is it propaganda? And a lot of the time, you have to use that video and you have to leave it to the viewer to decide. And you can put caveats around it, and we are unable to verify, we're unable to independently assess the validity of this. But at the end of the day, the viewer will have to decide. And without having reporters on the ground being able to be independent and impartial and objective, then it's going to be very, very difficult for anyone to tell that story.
Thanks. We've seen launches in the last couple of weeks, really, of a couple of websites, Ezra Klein's Vox website, a similar one by the New York Times quite recently, which are, they're not about investigations with top lines, they're not about foreign news, they're about understanding the news, understanding the story behind the story, data, the driest of dry subjects around data, about public policy and business and so on. Do you think that there is a kind of a market for those sorts of websites? Do you think that they're representing a niche out there, and that they might actually then push conventional outlets like the Times or Channel 4 to think about journalism in a slightly different way, and what constitutes news and what the audience actually wants?
I hope there's a market for those standalone companies. I'm not sure there is one. If it drives, if 538, if Nate Silver's leaving the New York Times, drove the New York Times to do the upshot, that's a good outcome, right? Doesn't mean 538 is going to do well, but it's part of ESPN, so it might. If I were doing a very rational analysis of Ezra Klein's venture and what it would take to get it started on its own, I wouldn't have funded it either. So I don't think that there is the idea that you will tell everything through data and cards and kind of shareable bites of analysis can grow tired very quickly, because there are times you want to do that, there are times you want to read the long story, there are times you want to watch a video. So newsrooms and brands that can offer a combination of that, I think, have a better chance of doing well. But your earlier point is really great, which is that that is the other interesting thing that's happened, where very difficult stories about healthcare or insurance or crime statistics are being told in a much more interesting, engaging way because of the data-driven model. And I think that's great that some of these tough stories, which would have bored the hell out of most readers if written as a 4,000-word piece, are now being presented in such a way that they're engaging more. So that is a good sign.
So I have one small thought. We talked about this a little bit on yesterday's panel that Raju and I were on, which is the one thing that I think the one thing that concerns me right now is the way that journalism has moved into silos in a way, which is on the one end of the spectrum, you can get long read things or quite academic things from something like Project Syndicate, and on the other hand, and as you go through the spectrum, you've got listicles from BuzzFeed. And you can't, there's no one place to get that. There's discussion about curation and finding a way to bring trusted sources together. But the one thing that I think that spectrum does do is it's nice experimentation. Everybody's doing a good job of showing what works and what doesn't work, so that some of the larger companies with more funding can then say, oh, people like that kind of thing, we'll do more of that thing in our stuff. And so that's one piece that's interesting. I'm not a big fan of this sort of bros style. I think we had a funny Twitter discussion the other day with Emily Bell where she called it mansplanatory journalism. And I tweeted back, could you please mansplain that to me better? Quote unquote, said no woman ever. And so, and I don't know how you're going to translate that into Italian, but I think, it's really important. When I say we need to meet people where they are and explain things to them, that doesn't mean we have to talk to them like they're toddlers. I do think that we must be better about not using lingo. You know, I'm very careful when I write about the boardroom not to use board speak or you know, the shortcuts for things or whatever, because part of my responsibility, I feel, is to communicate very clearly and in a straightforward manner in words that both you and I understand, rather than actually driving you away from it by using legalistic terms or something. So sometimes my stuff might even come across a little bit simplistic, perhaps, I don't know, but particularly because I'm trying to make it clear, not make you feel like an outsider, but draw you in. So I think there's a way of explaining things without mansplaining it. And I think that's a big piece of it. I would say, by the way, that, because there are a lot of young journalists here as well, and that's quite exciting and a good opportunity, I would say that the one thing that I'd like to see people do is ask harder questions. In a way, your job as a journalist is the same as my job as a board director. My job as a board director, as an independent board director, is actually to ask the hard questions. And that's very similar to what your job is as a journalist. And a lot of people have stayed away from writing about the boardroom or some other difficult areas because they just hear a lot of no. But actually, no is not no. It's just, I don't want to talk to you about that, or I don't feel comfortable with that. But if Watergate or anything else you had taken a no the first time around, where would you be? You shouldn't be taking that no from anybody, and you need to find a better way of getting that story or developing sources so that they're willing to talk to you. And so the one thing that I would say that's really important is that you have to ask the hard questions, and then how you communicate that is a decision of, you know, do you do it in a card, or do you do it in 400 words or 800 words or 1,000 words? It's what the story needs to get it across, but I don't think you need to dumb it down.
It is funny though, nobody says Watergate was mansplaining because Bob Woodward and the other guy were guys, right? I think it's a valid point that some of these new companies don't have enough women, but I'm not sure how that's going to fundamentally change either the business model or the fact that they're a data-based business, right?
It was just a point about
but
how
mansplaining
you talk,
does label
down.
it.
No, but it was about talking down.
Women talk down too, right?
I would never talk down to you. Well, I might. You never see me talking down to you.
Business models and gender issues.
No, but I think actually it's no longer that terminology in a way is no longer a gender issue, but more a style of speaking. This sort of, come on, you guys.
Why is that a mansplaining thing? Why is
it
that?
just is a thing. It's a
reverse
dumbsplaining.
sexism, isn't it?
Yeah.
It might be.
Yes, it is.
It is.
That's okay. The minute you have enough sexism to get back to me from women to men.
Sorry, we're off topic.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that's
No, wait.
Let's take it outside.
I want to stay on this one. This is getting good.
talking about the tough questions. I mean, we have that in Germany too, about gender and how many women are in the news and the journalism business. And people would just come up, men and women would say, oh, you know what, if you have a female boss, everything changes and there's another style, and they make it with the hands like this. And then you ask, so, and what exactly is that other style? And nobody really can explain that, so please leave that argument out.
Well, you should have come to our Where Are the Women panel yesterday. That was a good one. You can watch it on video.
I would just take it a slightly different direction, because
Thank you.
It's just getting good.
Because I think one of the areas here is inaccessible places, and whether it's the Upshot 538 Vox, I think competition is good, but I think what keeps a lot of journalists up at night is how do you reach the young people, the 16 to 34s, they're very digital savvy, they're living on their mobile phones. How do we as traditional television journalists reach out to those guys and make tough topics accessible without having to do a list, or if you do have to do a list, at least make it something that is telling you something important in the world. We've tried to do, lots of short form video to put to mobile. We've tried to do a program called What the For, where we try and take tougher topics to young people. But I think it's one of those areas which is going to keep us up awake in the future. We really have to get to identify how do we get kids interested, and how do we get young people, and it's young people in general interested in really tough topics and get them engaged, because they are interested, but it's like you've got to get that to them, and you've got to get inside their mobile phones.
See, now all of our tweets are going to be about mansplainatory journalism. That's not the topic of this.
Questions?
Come on.
So I know that you said a couple times, don't put people's lives at risks, and that's the bottom line for Channel 4 News. But there is a lot of pressure on young people, especially freelancers, to have competitive pitches, and I think there is a temptation to go to places that are hard to reach and possibly dangerous, and like Mali, for example, which isn't necessarily an active conflict zone, but is definitely very dangerous. And so I'm curious if you have any advice, all of you, I'm looking at Ed, but I'm talking to everyone. If you have any advice for young freelancers, is it don't go, get training, get hired on staff? What advice do you have?
I wouldn't encourage you to go under any circumstances. I mean, if we send somebody to Mali or Nigeria or wherever it is, they will need to be trained. They'll have to have done their HEFAT course, so Hostile Environment First Aid Training course, which includes battlefield first aid. They would need to be with a strong body, a team of people, and we'll really look at where they're going. We've got a team going to eastern Ukraine today. We'll do a risk assessment. We'll assess just what the situation on the ground is. We'll have safety protocols in place with them. We'll have backup teams back here. If you go to Mali and jump on a plane and end up, who have you got back here watching out for you? Who's going to be the person that's going to really sort of pick up the case for you if something happens. So it's a very, it may look very, like it's an idea to forward your career, to jump on a plane and go somewhere and make your name. But, just look at the number. Every year the Royal Television Society has an awards ceremony. At the start of the night, there is a list that runs through of all the journalists who've been killed around the world. And every year it gets longer and longer. And lots of them are people that we've known at Channel 4 News. And so it's not, it's not worth the risk unless you've really done your homework, really done your training, really got people with you who are on your side.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry. No, and to add to the idea of freelancers, I mean, staffers at the biggest, best funded news organizations also can feel that pressure. I mean, there's a lot in common between a late career staffer who feels that he or she needs to continue to prove himself as compared to the young freelancers or new staffers who are coming in. This is something you and your supervisors at any point along the way have to be aware of the pressures and look out for people, look out for the signs that somebody, maybe he got a bad review last year and all of a sudden he's volunteering to go to Syria. That should be a red flag, like, no, you don't have to put your life at risk to save your pension, which is kind of the same thing as the beginning of a career. And so whether it's the freelancer or the staffer, look for the red flags about what the supervisors are saying. If you pitch a story to an editor or producer, and she says, yeah, okay, yeah, great, go. You've been abroad before, you have a passport, go, do that. Avoid that situation, because that's just going to be the first step in a lot of things that can go wrong. That doesn't mean that within that organization or another one you can't find the right people who will make sure that you're looked after, but you say, okay, that person will be good for helping me develop the story idea, but not for keeping me alive. Tick that box, go find the other person, whether it's in your risk department or another editor or another division, and you can put that together. But it's, bad things have happened to people at all, beginning, middle, and end. Okay, we have a couple more minutes. Let's do another question.
I came in a bit late, so forgive me if this was covered earlier and I missed it. But I went to a panel at the Frontline Club about Vice News on Wednesday night. And that's a brand that's really engaging young people, and that's a brand that does a lot of very popular online video content. And they were saying that theirs tends to be multi-part, very long individual clips. And I was wondering if it's the tone of that you think is engaging, or if there's something to be said about sort of long-form video journalism online being a popular format.
So we are through 21st Century Fox, we are an investor in Vice, so I know a little bit about them. The entire Vice model is really counter-programming, right? Everybody is doing quick things, and we will do long form. We will go to the weirdest places on earth and do it, and we will spare no expense. And it's working for Shane Smith and Vice. I am not sure that just because people are watching that necessarily means that that's the format that everybody's watching. We know from, for example, internal data that any video past a minute and a half, you see a 50% drop in the audience, right? That's just generally so anything that's 7 minutes means that you have a tiny fragment of audience at the end of that. Doesn't mean that...
In any age group or just in that particular age group?
I'm sorry?
In any age group or that particular age group?
No, generally speaking. Wow. Yeah, because the people's attention spans to web video is kind of really short. That doesn't mean that somebody is not going to watch a very compelling 15, 20-minute video, but the numbers are overwhelmingly in favor of shorter pieces than longer ones. Vice is just it's a risk-taking, interesting model, and it's working for them. I wouldn't kind of make that the future.
So, hey, a quick question for each of the panelists. What's the tough topic that your news organization is undercovering by the biggest extent, and why?
I'm sorry, I couldn't get
which is the tough topic that your news organization is doing least well, is underreporting the most, and why?
Wow. I don't mean this to be a cop-out. I'm not in the newsroom, so I don't have a view of, or I don't have a look into what their plans are and what they're doing. I consume it as like anybody else. But I would say, just from a personal point of view, probably the Indian election. World's largest democracy, 1 billion people, 800 million people voting. I don't think the coverage has been anywhere close to what it ought to be. So I see that as a gap. It's not a tough story in that sense, but it's a story that requires resources, so there hasn't been that much of a willingness to do that.
As a debate magazine, having the name The European at this point, the European election is very important, since we see in many European member countries a new sort of populism popping up, and figures representing that, and we try to see whether or not the arguments are valid. And another field or topic is Turkey and the current developments in Turkey, which since we have in Germany 3.3 million people with a Turkish background, and this country is still aiming to be a full member of the European Union, we of course have to focus on what is going on in that country with that current government.
It's a great question. At Bloomberg News, our bread and butter in coverage is covering financial institutions. Our literal bread and butter is financial institutions who, they buy the terminals that pay for the news operation. And that's where the rubber hits the road as far as needing to be on top of that day after day, year after year. And when, I do a gut check, what have I done in the past year to write a story that's both fair and very critical of, the people who also pay our bills. Every year I try to have that story that says, I took a close look at, name the bank, and that's what's important to us.
I'm thinking really hard about this because, of course, I can't speak more